Well, you're in for a treat. Our first speaker today is Dan Fisher. He's been a pastor at a church outside of Oklahoma City of about 1,000 in regular attendance for over 21 years as a faithful man of God. But he's also written a book that's in the back called Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment. And you're going to see a short presentation of what he also travels around the country doing. But he doesn't just write a book about it. He doesn't just travel to churches and share it. He also ran for the state legislature, and while he's a full-time pastor, while he's speaking to other churches, he also serves in the Oklahoma legislature. Would you please welcome Dan Fisher?
When I walk up here at this time, I'm carrying a musket that Private Isaac Cook crossed the Delaware River with and fought with Washington at the Battle of Trenton. What you're going to see here today is an abbreviated version of what I traveled the country doing. On September the 10th, 1777, as the sun was setting on the bank of the Brandywine River, a young preacher by the name of Joab Trout, just 25 years of age, stood before General Washington and the troops, and he preached a very short message, probably didn't take more than 10 minutes. And then he ended with an amazing prayer as he tried to rally the men to fight the next day. And he said, part of the prayer, "Great Father, we are in times of trouble, O Lord, and sore beset by foes, merciless and unpitying. The sword gleams over our land. The dust of the sod is dampened with the blood of our neighbors and friends. O God of mercy, we pray thy blessing upon the American arms. Visit the tents of our host. Nerve him for the fight and prepare him for the hour of death. So shall we return thanks to thee through Christ our Redeemer." And then he paused for a moment and he looked out across that crowd and he yelled out, "God prosper the cause." The next day, September the 11th, 1777, the Americans fought at the Battle of Brandywine. And that 25-year-old preacher gave his life fighting for liberty so that you and I can be here today and enjoy the kind of freedoms that we've enjoyed for all of our lives. You see, these pastors who got up every Sunday morning in their pulpits wearing black robes and preaching scarves were men who believed that the Bible touched on everything. This idea of separation of church and state was completely foreign to them. The concept that there is sacred and secular to them, as for the believer, would have been something they couldn't have even computed. These men believed that the Bible addressed everything, especially tyranny. They had been preaching liberty for 30 or 40 years since the First Great Awakening, and these pastors knew that they were up against tyranny. A great Christian in that day was a man by the name of Patrick Henry. Though not a preacher, he could speak like a preacher. And on March the 23rd, 1775, in St. John's Episcopal Church, he spoke to the Virginia Convention. You remember, he gave those now famous words, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty." And those there said, he made a dagger motion and said, "Or give me death." Well, sitting in that congregation that day was a young man of 30 years of age. His friends called him Pete. Some of them called him Devil Pete, but his name was Peter Muhlenberg. Peter Muhlenberg served with Patrick Henry in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. He also served alongside General George Washington, who was not quite a general yet. And he was a pastor, a Lutheran pastor in Woodstock, Virginia. Well, when he heard his fellow delegate give that speech, though he had been preaching liberty from his pulpit for months and months and months, he knew that was the line for him. And so on January the 21st, 1776, Peter Muhlenberg announced, "This will be my final sermon as your pastor." People had come for miles. He opens up to Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time for all things chapter. And then he gets to verse 8 where it says there's a time of war and a time of peace. And then he did something that most of his members had never seen a pastor do, not in their day anyway. He stepped down out of the pulpit and he said, "There is a time for all things. There's a time to preach and a time to pray, but there is also a time to fight." He said, "And that time has now come for me." And then he stepped aside and he began to do something right there in that church that those Christians had never seen. Because publicly, he began to reveal a colonial soldier's uniform. You see, just days before, George Washington and Patrick Henry had recommended Muhlenberg for a commission as colonel, and he began to recruit the men of his church that morning to join the 8th Virginia Regiment. He led them throughout the entire war and was a fantastic commander in general, ultimately promoted to major general. That's Lutheran preacher Peter Muhlenberg. Another preacher this time a Presbyterian, James Caldwell, pastored in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. He was a fiery preacher. He'd say things like, there are times when it is as righteous to fight as it is to pray. British put out a bounty on his head, and he would walk into his pulpit every Sunday. Normally, I have my flintlocks hooked into his pants. He'd walk up to the pulpit, pull out the flintlocks, lay them on the pulpit, preach. Then he was finished, put the flintlocks back in his belt, walk to the back and greet his congregation. I've often said a preacher holding 2 loaded flintlocks, when he takes an offering or gives an invitation, I promise you'll do something. The British made good on their threat, and they killed his wife. And so after he helped do her funeral, he went on to Springfield, New Jersey, where his men were fighting. They had run out of wadding for their muskets. You can't use a musket without wadding. So he runs down to the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield, gets hymn books filled with hymns written by Isaac Watts, rides back, throws out the hymn books, tells his men, tear out the pages and stuff them down your flintlocks. So you just get this mental picture. His men are shooting Isaac Watts hymns at the redcoats, and while they're doing it, he's yelling, give them Watts, boys, put Watts into them. And that's the Presbyterian preacher, James Caldwell. Now, the British understood the problem. They knew that the pastors were the main point of agitation. King George said this is a Presbyterian rebellion. Horace Walpole, the son of the British Prime Minister, said to Parliament, there's no need in crying about it. Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian parson. Now, of course, it wasn't just Presbyterian. The gunpowder so the British couldn't get it, and he hid it under his pulpit. Every Sunday he's preaching these fiery sermons standing on hundreds of pounds of gunpowder. It's a wonder he didn't make a spark and blow the thing up with those sermons. Of course, today's preachers wouldn't be in any danger because their watered down sermons couldn't start a fire if you threw a match on them. But this guy, it's a wonder that he didn't set the place and blow it up. John Treadwell of Lynn, Massachusetts, kept a loaded flintlock in his pulpit. When he would go up to preach on Sundays, he would have a Bible under one arm and his cartridge box under the other. Or Jonathan French, when he heard about the Battle of Bunker Hill, you know what he did? As a pastor, went home, got his flintlock and his medical bag, and marched off and joined the Continental Army. Now, this is a pastor I love to talk about. This is Reverend Thomas Allen from Massachusetts. Notice he's the chaplain and the commander of the Berkshire Militia. These chaplains prayed and preached, and then when the time came to fight, they stood right beside their men and fought. For example, at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, August the 16th, 1777, he marches out with his men wearing his preaching robe. He lines up his men, and then he walks on ahead of them, gets out into the killing zone. His men are thinking, what's the preacher doing? There was a tree that had blown over. He jumps up on the stump and yells out to the British and the Tories and gives them the opportunity to surrender before he tells his men to open fire. Well, they respond with a volley of musket fire. One of the musket balls goes through his hat, pulls it off. Incensed, he walks back to his men, picks up a flintlock, aims it, and yells to his men, "Fire!" And he fights all day long at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. A few days after the battle, one of the members of his church said, "Pastor, I heard that the other day you fought like a common soldier." And he said, "Oh yeah, it was hot fighting. Every man had to do his duty." He said, "But Pastor, did you kill anybody?" And he said, "Well, I don't know if I killed anybody, but I noticed behind a certain bush there was a flash, and every time there was a flash, one of our men would fall. I took steady aim and fired at that bush. I don't know if I killed anybody, but I put out that flash." And that's Pastor Thomas Allen. These preachers were men of incredible courage. Notice historians before the war between the states, John Thornton said, the fathers of the Republic did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly. What are we told today? The exact opposite. It's ungodly if you mix the two. Here's a Black Robe Regiment preacher, George Duffield from Philadelphia. When the war was over, listen to what he said thinking back. "As quick as a flash of lightning glares from pole to pole, so sudden did a military spirit then pervade those then limited colonies. Nor," he says, "were those of the Sacred Order wanting to their country when her civil and religious liberties were all at stake. But as became faithful watchmen, they blew the trumpet on the walls of our Zion and sounded an alarm for defense." And here's Episcopalian Black Robe preacher William Smith. Listen to what he said. "We know that our civil and religious liberties are linked together in one indissoluble bond. Religion and liberty must flourish or fall together in America. We pray that both may be perpetual." So God creates the family, government, and the church to perpetuate peace and promote the gospel. But the last 100 years, we've been telling preachers you can't preach about government, even though it's an institution of God. So government has risen up, and now it's trying to destroy the other two. That's what happens when you take salt and light out of the arena. Now let's begin to wrap up by ending where we started. Peter Muhlenberg wasn't the only preacher in the Muhlenberg family. He had a brother named Frederick. But Frederick was like a lot of modern preachers. He told his brother, "Man, you can't get involved in politics. You can't get involved in fighting. You're a preacher. You're above that kind of thing." Well, Peter heard about it, and so he writes a letter back to his brother Frederick, and here's a portion of it. He says, "Frederick, I am a clergyman, it is true, but I am a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberty is as dear to me as to any man. Shall I then sit still and enjoy myself at home when the best blood of the continent is spilling? Heaven forbid it." Kind of sounds like Patrick Henry, doesn't it? And then he goes on to say, "Do you think if America should be conquered that I should be safe? Why, far from it. And would you not sooner fight like a man than die like a dog? I am called by my country to its defense. The cause is just and noble. And so far am I from thinking that I am wrong. It is," he says, "my duty so to do, a duty I owe to my God and my country." Now, these men understood what was at stake. Did Frederick see the light? No, but he felt the heat. Because not long after that, the British invaded New York, and you know what they did? They came in burning churches. Frederick barely got out of there alive with the members of his family. And so what did Mr. Can't Get Involved in Politics do then? Well, he joined the Continental Congress. And then he joined the House of Representatives of Pennsylvania. And the preacher that said preachers and Christians shouldn't get involved in politics became the first Speaker of the House of the United States of America. Now, what happened to Frederick? I'll tell you what happened to him. He got pinched. He got caught in a vice. He was pinched hard enough that he knew he had to do something. I often wonder how hard our modern preacher is going to have to be pinched before we stand up and speak out. Samuel Adams said that if ever a time comes when vain and aspiring men shall possess the highest seats in government, our country will stand in need of its experienced patriots to prevent its ruin. I submit to you that time has now come. Edmund Burke said, "All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." Dietrich Bonhoeffer understood this in World War II Germany. He's one of the few that stood up. It cost him his life. But before it did, he said, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." Charles Finney, Second Great Awakening, sweeps across America. Finney is preaching, and he's telling people that it's the pulpit that's responsible. And he was right. The church is who God is looking at. 2 Chronicles 7:14, "If my people," not the unbeliever, my people. Peter says judgment must begin at the house of God first. Friends, God is looking at us. Unfortunately, half of evangelicals in America don't even vote. So you see, we are not standing up. Now, why are they not voting? I think, as a pastor, I can say this because many of our pastors do not connect the dots. That's why I believe we must bring back the spirit of the Black Robe Regiment. I've been involved with Alliance Defending Freedom now since 2008. We've been standing up against the IRS saying, yes, preachers can preach the truth. No, they do not have to ask for permission. Friend, I'm telling you, we went from 33 pastors nationwide over 1,600 the last time. It is time for God's watchmen on the wall to sound the alarm just like they did in the 18th century. The pastors oversaw the rising of the sun of this great country, but if we're not careful, we pastors are going to oversee the setting of the sun on this great country. It is time that we bring back the Black Robe Regiment. I would love to visit with you. I travel the country making this presentation. I have some books back here. They're $30 a set. It's 2-volume series. Gives you the history of these guys, sermon excerpts, all of these things. But friends, stand with us and let's bring back the Black Robed Regiment. God bless you. Thank you. God bless you, brother.
You're in for another treat. Just like you heard from a pastor who's also a legislator who's also involved, you're about to hear from another pastor who's an attorney. I'm an attorney also, and a lot of people think that's antithetical. You can't be both. Well, you're about to hear from somebody who is, and I know a lot of godly attorneys, and I know a lot of pastors who are getting more and more involved either in litigation. Matt Staver started Liberty Counsel in 1989. They have hundreds of affiliates all over the country. He is going to help educate all of us to what churches and pastors can and cannot do and dispel the myths that most pastors live in. Would you please join me in welcoming Matt Staver?
Well, it's very good to be here and glad to see so many people concerned about the direction of our country and the soul of America. I want to talk about what pastors and churches can do. And then I also want to speak to you as a pastor. Before I was a lawyer, I was a pastor, but I still have a calling and a ministry to churches and pastors around the country. And I believe, just like you, I didn't get my calling to be a pastor from the IRS. Did you? I didn't go to my mailbox to find out whether I was called to preach from the IRS. That calling came from God, and that calling will always come from God. And my direction and what I say or what you say in the pulpit must not be censored by Uncle Sam, but also must be in alliance with God Almighty Himself. I have a DVD in the back. It's free. You can take them and pass them out. If you need some more, we have additional. I'm going to briefly go over what's on this DVD because it is in more detail there. But there is a significant difference between pastors and churches and other nonprofit organizations. Churches are different than nonprofit organizations. Liberty Counsel, for example, is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. Contributions to it are tax deductible. Churches fall in that same category. But the difference between churches and nonprofit organizations that are not churches is that churches do not need a tax-exempt letter from the IRS. Thomas Road Baptist Church, founded by Dr. Jerry Falwell, never obtained the IRS exemption letter and never will, and it is still tax exempt. That's a significant issue that is different. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In 1934, the lobbying restriction came into the IRS code, and in 1954, the political intervention supporting or endorsing political candidates for elected office. But since those times, not one church in America, not one, has ever lost its tax-exempt status. So this whole myth that you'll lose or jeopardize your tax-exempt status for supporting or opposing local or state or national legislation or speaking out on the political issues that are really biblical issues is really a myth. You will not, and no church never has. Now, the definition of lobbying is being in favor of or in opposition to a local, state, or national law. You either take a position on it, you can ask your people to support or oppose a particular sexually-oriented business law or whatever it might be, and you can take a full-page ads out in the newspaper and oppose some kind of sexually-oriented business or some other kinds of pornography or whatever it might be in your local or state or national. And that is lobbying. It includes voter initiatives. So in this state, several years ago, we had a marriage amendment. That falls in the category of lobbying. Churches and pastors can take a specific position on it and associate their name with it. Now, we may not devote more than what's called a substantial part of your overall activity toward lobbying. But what is that? This is a very simple illustration as to what that means. Generally, there's a 5 to 15% guideline. 5% of your overall activity is perfectly permissible. 15% of your overall activity gets to the area where it may cross the line. But even if you cross the line, the consequences are almost zero. But let's look at the minimum 5% that we know for a fact nonprofits and churches can do without even coming close to jeopardizing their tax-exempt status. Take this church. It's a do-nothing church. You may have pastored a do-nothing church in your history. You may have had do-nothing Sunday school teachers. Hopefully, you've never been a do-nothing pastor, but this is really a do-nothing church. It really does nothing. It has 3 hours on Sunday, 9 to 12, and an hour and a half midweek, total 4.5 hours of complete activity, no paid staff, and the pastor doesn't actually prepare for the message. He just comes there at 9 o'clock, opens up the scriptures and preaches. After 12 o'clock, doesn't even think anything more about it. The Sunday school teachers, they just open up their scriptures. They don't prepare. This church has no preparation before or after, no volunteerism, and no paid staff. It literally has only 4.5 hours of activity a week. Well, this do-nothing church, what's 5% of that? 13 and a half minutes. This do-nothing church, on its do-nothing Sunday, could devote 13 and a half minutes toward lobbying or against lobbying every single Sunday. Now, what happens if it missed a Sunday, didn't have anything to talk about? Well, then it's 13 and a half minutes times 2, and if it missed 3 Sundays, it's 13 and a half minutes times 3. The point is, you could essentially have your church become a lobbying machine. Now, I know that you don't want to do that. You want to speak the scriptures. But the illustration and the point I'm trying to make is you're not even going to come close to this line. Now, let's add a little bit of activity to this do-nothing church. This is a church that now has a 40-hour paid pastor and a 20-hour assistant. And now your Sunday school teachers, they have 5 of them, and they volunteer 1 hour a week. That's a total of 69 and a half hours, still a very minimal church. Now, 69 and a half hours, 5% of that is 3.5 hours. That means this church every week could devote 3.5 hours for or against supporting legislation or local ordinances or laws. That's why no church has ever come close to violating the tax-exempt status for supporting or opposing local, state, or national laws. Now let's look at the political intervention. We've got a big election coming up here in Virginia, and this is a prohibition that says you cannot support or endorse or oppose a political candidate. In other words, the church cannot say it is in favor of or against a particular candidate. It is an absolute prohibition. It does not apply to people who are appointed to office. That falls in the lobbying category. So if you got someone that's nominated for an appointed position by the governor or by the president, that's not an elected position. So it doesn't fall under this category. But under this category, let's look at the church at Pierce Creek in 1992. It took out full-page ads in the USA Today newspaper and the Washington Times, and it specifically opposed then-Governor Bill Clinton for president because of his position on abortion. The church spent tens of thousands of dollars for those ads, put its church address at the bottom, and solicited more donations so it could run more ads, specifically associating the name with opposing the presidential candidate. Well, as you know, that he was actually elected, and then this church got a call from the IRS. Now, this church could have simply resolved it because there's no more elections for 2 to 4 years. But the church wanted to take the IRS on. This church had chosen to voluntarily obtain a letter. About half the churches in the country have a letter, about half do not. It really makes absolutely no difference whether you have a letter or not. This one had a letter, and the IRS came to the church, and the church says, we're going to continue to endorse or oppose candidates, period. Get out of our location. And then the IRS revoked their tax-exempt status letter. They sued to get the letter back, but when it went to the Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals said that, in fact, the letter was just symbolic and only had no substance to it, and therefore no tax deductions were ever lost. Not a single contribution was ever taxable. That church never lost its tax-exempt status from that moment to today. And in fact, churches, if we were to gather together, and this was our first meeting today as a church, from this moment on, as we're gathering as our first inaugural meeting, we are tax-exempt under the IRS code. We don't need to get a letter from the IRS. Liberty Counsel or some other nonprofit organization, if it's going to get tax exemption, not a church, it needs to get a letter. So it needs to apply to the IRS and wait 12 to 14 to 18 months in order to get that letter. But a church doesn't need a letter. So even if this church crossed the line on Sunday by specifically endorsing or opposing a candidate, then on Monday, if it didn't do it, it's born again. It makes no difference to that church. because it comes right back into its tax-exempt situation. That's why no church has ever lost its tax-exempt status. This church clearly went across the line, but even that church never lost its status. So let's look at what you clearly can do without going as far as this particular church in New York. Pastors can preach on any topic. Just because the politicians are speaking about abortion or same-sex marriage or poverty does not make it a political issue. They still are biblical issues, and pastors can always preach on any topic from the Scriptures. You can also explain the candidate's position. So if you're speaking on marriage and the biblical understanding of marriage, you can also speak about the candidates. This candidate believes this candidate believes that. You can also give out objective voter guides so that you can preach a biblical message, and you can also give them information about where the candidates stand on this biblical message. And you can also encourage people to vote and to register to vote. Voting, by the way, in my view, is not a political act. It is a prophetic witness to the community. As you are and act and believe on Sunday, you ought to act and believe on Tuesday. There should not be a disconnect between your values. If you believe, for example, that God is the creator and that abortion is wrong, and that's what the Scriptures say, and I believe it's true, then how can we put an agent in office, in any level of office, that actually is contrary to our biblical values, who will act on our behalf, in our stead, contrary to our core Christian values and biblical beliefs? Now, you can also invite candidates to speak, and they can also be acknowledged. So you can say, here's John Doe, here's Mary, and they're running for local office or state or federal office, and you can invite them, welcome them, and acknowledge them in your church. They can speak from your pulpit. You can have a candidate forum where you invite them, all of the different candidates, to speak, and they can have a presentation and answer questions from the congregation. You can register them to vote, and that's very critical. You know, most churches, if we're speaking out on biblical values, but our people are not registered to vote, they're not making a difference in our culture, in our community. We need to get them to register to vote as a prophetic witness to the community, to actually carry our values into our community, into our state, and into our nation. You can actually encourage people to register. You can bus them to the polls at the time of the election. So you can do a lot of kinds of things to get them and encourage them to register. You can lend your name to a particular politician. You can have it in a newspaper ad or a brochure, Pastor so-and-so of such and such church. You can actually be endorsing or opposing a particular candidate in that particular publication, as long as you have an asterisk by your name that says title and affiliation for identification purposes. And again, all of this is on the DVD that you can get free. You can clearly be very involved in translating your biblical values into action in your community. And again, no church has ever lost its tax exemption for either lobbying or for endorsing or opposing a political candidate or what's called political intervention. What we want to do, what we want to encourage you to do today, is to remove the muzzle that the world wants to put on you and to literally replace it with a megaphone. Liberty Counsel is our nonprofit organization. We're here to give you some guidance and help. We will represent you at no cost on this and other issues of religious liberty and life and family. But again, no one has ever come close to violating any of these rules or jeopardizing their tax-exempt status. Let me, in the few moments that I have now, speak to you as a pastor, because bottom line is, there is nothing for you to worry about the IRS. If you're not speaking, it's not because of the IRS. That's not the reason, because there's no church that has ever lost its tax-exempt status. But I can tell you, from my perspective as a former pastor and someone who loves pastors and churches, and also someone who is in the culture wars around the country, we are living in unprecedented times in America. And all future generations always thought that their generation was living in more difficult times than previous generations. But let me just give you two different things that we are facing now that we've never faced before. With Obamacare as an example, Liberty University here is a Christian university. It is founded upon the very notion and the biblical belief that God is the creator and that He creates our lives and He infuses us with human dignity because we are created in the image of God. And consequently, we will not participate in murder. We will not cross the line to participate or facilitate abortion. But for the first time in American history, Not only do we have abortion in America, but we crossed the line so that the government is now telling Liberty and other organizations around the country that you must fund abortion. We have a Christian mission. It is to train champions for Christ. That is our God-given mission, and we cannot violate that core belief. But we are facing a situation where we are told if you want to continue to train champions for Christ, you must fund abortion. That is a line we cannot and will not compromise. That is an unprecedented clash with religious freedom and the right to worship our Creator. And another situation that has just come about. June 26, 5 justices of the United States Supreme Court said that the 1996 legislature that was composed of bipartisanship that passed the Federal Defense of Marriage Act that affirmed, not designed, not created, but affirmed the God-given natural created order across party lines, which we don't see today. That Congress, and by implication everyone else who believes like that Congress did, was hateful, bigoted, and they are enemies against humanity because they believe that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. I say to Justice Kennedy and the other 4 justices, and I say this strongly as an attorney who is also an officer of the court, how dare they say that those who believe in marriage are bigots and haters of humanity? Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in 1992 in the abortion decision that ultimately was upholding Roe versus Wade, but originally it was written for the first 30 days to overturn it, and in the next 30 days Kennedy switched his vote and they upheld it. She said the reason why they have to uphold Roe versus Wade is because the only power of the court is in the confidence of the people. The legislature passes the law, the executive enforces the law, but the courts have no power at all. The only power that they have is that the people think that their decisions are legitimate. Therefore, if we were to change course, even though it was wrong back in 1973, the people would lose confidence in the court and we would lose our authority. It was a self-preservation decision, she said. Well, let's look at a couple of decisions that all of us would agree today did not reflect the rule of law then or now. Chief Justice Taney, during the time of Abraham Lincoln, wrote the Dred Scott decision. And in that decision, he said, sorry, Dred Scott, you don't have rights as a U.S. citizen. Get out of court because some people believe that blacks are inferior human beings. How dare Taney say that? I don't care if he sits on the highest court in the country. That was not the rule of law then, and it's not the rule of law now. It was a bigoted decision that is against God's natural law and revealed law. No one would defend that decision today who's in their right mind. And in the 1920s, a lady by the name of Mrs. Buck, Carrie Buck, right here in the greater Lynchburg area, was taken to a facility and she was forcibly sterilized by the state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, as part of the eugenics movement that happened here with Planned Parenthood and others, and also was carried on by Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. She was part of that eugenics movement to remove the quote-unquote undesirables from our community. She wanted redress from the highest court in the land. She took her case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's called Buck versus Bell. And in that decision, one of the justices whose statue is prominently currently displayed at the United States Supreme Court said, sorry, Mrs. Buck, we will not give you the justice you seek because, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. How dare he say that? That was not the rule of law then, and it is not the rule of law now. It was contrary to the natural law, and it is contrary to revealed law. It was just an opinion of an individual justice, and some of those who believe in marriage are bigots and haters of humanity should be treated in the exact same way that Dred Scott decision is treated today, that Buck versus Bell decision is treated today. It is not, in my opinion, reflective of natural law, biblical law, or common sense. It is contrary to the natural created order of God Almighty. My friends, these are not political decisions. These are biblical core values. We can debate on immigration. We can debate on different kinds of roles of government, but on the fact that God created you and I in His image, and life begins in the womb, that marriage is a union of one man and one woman, that crosses party lines, that crosses denominations, that is a core belief. We cannot capitulate or compromise on those core values. If you go back to the American Revolution, it was the Great Awakening that ultimately fueled the fire of the American Revolution. It was the sermons of pastors that ultimately was the fuel of the American Revolution. It was the spiritual awakening that gave birth to the political freedom. That was in the first Great Awakening here in America. It was pastors who were right at the very center of the American Revolution, where revival was preached from the pulpits, and pastors spoke biblical truth to the go across the pond. It was in the Second Great Awakening that happened, and a man by the name of William Wilberforce was ultimately touched, and his life was transformed. And as a result of that Great Awakening, he devoted his life to the abolition of slavery and the reformation of manners. And that happened in Great Britain and eventually came to this country and around the world. We need a spiritual revival in America. We need it more desperately now than we've ever had in our existence in America. May God ultimately wake up the churches today. May He empower you as pastors to preach biblical truth. Don't be afraid of the IRS. It is a myth. Only, I believe, the hope of America is in the pulpits today. Future of America rests in your hands. Will we have a generation that ultimately blesses this generation for standing for biblical values and truth against opposition that is significant and unprecedented? Or will that future generation ask us, why were we silent? May God ultimately bless you. May God encourage you as you become the watchman on the wall to speak biblical truth and raise up a new generation and bring revival and renewal to our land, to this area of Virginia, to the United States of America, and may it ripple around the world. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Well, I hope you've been blessed today. I want to take a few minutes before Rick comes up and share with you a new tool that we're developing. We call this project the Pew Initiative, and I want to run through just a few slides to give you the big picture and what we're trying to develop as a tool to put in your hands, not to add any more burden to you, but to give you a tool to do what we believe God's called pastors to do. If you'll look at this first slide, you'll see that less than half of the Christians in the country, we'll get it up in a second, are registered to vote. Go two more over, please. And so what that means is if your church is 200 people on a given Sunday, if you stood up and said, I want every one of you to vote, I want you to vote biblical values, half of them couldn't even do what you ask them to do because they've never gotten in the game. They've never even stepped in. And we're going to give you a tool to help remedy that problem. The second problem is those who are registered to vote. Are we having a problem with the slide? I'm just going to go through it. He'll catch up in a minute. Those who are registered to vote, half of those vote in a presidential year, which is the highest turnout. So if only half are registered, what does that mean? Simple math, 25% of Christians vote for the president. But it gets worse. In non-presidential years, where we elect the Congress and the Senate, 2/3 of who legislate federally in our nation, and all of our governors and people who run our state house legislatures, only 12.5% of Christians turn out to vote who those are. Who decides who those candidates are? In primary elections, less than 5% of the total population, including Christian, decide who the candidates even are. So you can see, well, wait a second, let's back up and do this in reverse. If it only takes 5% to influence this, you don't need a lot of turnout if people finally understand, wait a minute, I am a citizen of heaven. That is my true home. There's a lot of pain, a lot of suffering down here. The longer you live, the more you get aware of that. And so we long for our home in heaven. And yet God's called us to be salt and light. Paul talks about this dilemma. I wish that I could go and be with Him, but it's more necessary that I'm down here. So as long as we're here, let's try to do something. I got saved 27 years ago.
I didn't grow up saved. I got saved by studying world religions in college, and I instantly started, I was the on-fire guy that had studied all the world religions, and so lots of people said, young man, you need to go to seminary. You're too excited about this stuff. You need to go do this. And I thought, excited about this? The hard question for me was, is there a God? If there was a God, whose God is it? And then, once I signed on to Jesus, bowed my knee in 1986 in the fall and took off after Him, I had no idea the whole church issue and denominations and all. I hadn't studied any of that. I just studied the original teachings of all those people. And I remember a phrase that my grandfather, who fought in World War II, told me. I was a young man, didn't care about anything when he passed away, but I loved my granddad. He was dying of cancer, and he pulled me in his room and he told everybody to get out. He said, let me tell you something, young man. He said, I almost died fighting for your right to vote. You better be at that election poll every time. I've never missed. He gave me a couple other instructions I don't need to share here today. To take care of my sisters, to get my education, which nobody in our family had ever done, and so I went about doing that. And I've served as an attorney. I've served as a pastor over college ministries, young adult ministries. Most of my friends are pastors. I love pastors. I serve pastors. This whole project came out of me trying to help some churches deal with this problem. And I want to share with you what we're developing and what we have ready for you today. We're calling this the Pew Initiative. And pastors who join with us in this initiative, these are the things that we're going to do to try to help you. A pastor simply needs to do a few things. He shares his membership with us. He's got to tell us he's got the authority to share that list. He understands our privacy policy. No one in your membership will be asked for money. They will not be sent mail. They will not be called. They will not be contacted. This is solely a tool for you to use to get your people registered and to get them mobilized to vote Christian values in this country and whatever your area of the country is. And so what will happen is as you share this list, you're going to get these three things. You're going to get a list. Let's say your church is 200 people, and we find out that these 100 people are not registered, if it's statistically true. And let me just tell you, with my pastor, I served for 12 years. I oversaw the college young adult ministry, and when we ran these numbers, my pastor didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. People that we knew who had walked doors, who had been involved, didn't vote. Because we live in a culture that we're distracted, right? By the cares of this life, the deceit of other things. We're constantly moving and slowly being choked out by those things. But when my pastor saw it, and I had several other pastors, I was working with a Promise Keepers organization. I was speaking in several different churches. And as an attorney, I'd worked with several pastors. So I did this for several different churches. Every single one of those pastors did something different. But every single one of those pastors, when he had good information, he did something. And I'm a firm believer that there's two things. We're going to give you as many tools as you want and as much help as you want, okay? But I believe with all my heart that if you're a pastor called by God, once you get the good information, you're going to do it how you do it in your church, in your culture, in your denomination, with your people, with your leadership style, it will get done. Most people read those statistics and go, but not my church, but not us, until you see the actual data and go, you got to be kidding me. Half of my people aren't even registered, and half of those don't vote for the president, and 87 of them don't vote this next election cycle or this year. That's exactly what the statistics, and then you can do it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to give you some draft emails, some draft snail mails if you want to do that, and draft scripts. If you want to call your people, email your people, mail your people, we're going to give you the tools to do it. So, for example, in Virginia, there is a link that we will give you, and you can send it to everybody you have an email for in your church that's not registered to vote, and online they can register to vote. I was talking to a pastor last week at another pastor's event, and he has gotten his church up now to 98% voter turnout. I mean, that's incredible. Just think, if half of us did that, if a third of us did that, it would literally change the election. And a lot of people talk about, well, you know, in the presidential election, you know, it was 39 million Christians who didn't vote. But well, I'm not as worried only about that one election. What about the Senate, who decides who sits on the Supreme Court and comes up with these decisions like homosexual marriage is what should be cast down our throats? That's what is also equally as important. Now, you're also going to get tools to help vote. What we're gonna do is give you emails and scripts, and as involved as you want to be in this project, after Rick talks, you're going to have the opportunity to sign up for this project. I'm going to give you my personal phone number, my personal email, and you're going to be able to call us. We're going to build this to where it starts manually, goes into a web app, and then eventually, hopefully, we're going to have this on a smartphone app where all you have to do is click a button and an email goes out from you to your people saying, here's what I'd like you to do. Now, at the end of the election cycle, what's going to happen is we're going to give you a report back. So, for example, in my earlier example, if you had 200 people, 100 weren't registered, you called them, you emailed them, and you snail mailed them, the old style paper, right? You're going to do all three of those. Well, what's going to happen is after the registration deadline, after the election, every single year you stay in the program, we're going to give you a report and say, here was the 100 people that were not registered, now 50 of them are. Here were the 75 that did not vote. These are the only ones left of the registered that still didn't. Pastor, you decide. Now, we're going to ask you not to call people up and embarrass them on church and do this. We're trusting that you're going to do this in a loving way. We're not going to be the ones primarily communicating to your people. We want you to do it the way that God's called you to do it. And then you're going to get another report after the election that says, here is the increase. And here's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to accomplish two things. One, we're trying to give you a tool to do what God's called you to do without you having to figure out all the logistics of that. We've been working on that for months, and we're going to have that ready. But the second thing that we really want to do is not just give you a tool, we want to show empirically that when a pastor gets involved, here's the difference. Because I've seen it in my own life, that if a pastor calls, it's going to be a 5% increase. If he calls and emails, it's a 10% increase. If he stands up in the pulpit and does it, it's a 20% increase. We're going to empirically know that when a pastor gets involved, and to the extent that a pastor gets involved, that is how the people are going to get out and vote. They will follow your lead, just like we heard in the earlier presentations, and it does matter. And so it's called the Pew Initiative. You're going to have a card. Duke is going to come up now and introduce Rick. And I will be in the back. I'll be here until the end, and I will stay after. If any of you want to find me, I will be the primary contact for this project. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Duke Westover. For 38 years, I was Jerry Falwell's chief of staff. I was his executive assistant. I managed his office. I managed his schedule. And I traveled with him everywhere. Somebody said, if you ever write a book, you'll call it, Wow, What a Ride. And that's a fact. I did write a book, incidentally, and that was the name of it. Working with Jerry Falwell all those years, I got to do things, meet people, and go places that as a young man you would only dream about. One of the ones that always comes to mind is in 1984, we did a pastor's event in Washington, D.C., similar to this. It was a 3-day event, and our last day, Jesse Helms was our morning speaker. Vice President Bush was our afternoon speaker, and President Ronald Reagan was the evening speaker. That's not a bad event. The Washington Post wrote the next day that we had 26,000 people there. And that's true. I'm really surprised that the Washington Post said something truthful for a saying. But that night, Ronald Reagan captured the imagination of 26,000 people. Now, I heard Ronald Reagan say, America is always just one generation away from losing its liberties. Now, after that, I thought to myself, I don't really understand that. This is 1984. We're the most powerful nation in the world. Now, who in the world is going to come over here to take my liberties away? Are the Russians, the Soviets, are they going to run a battleship right up the Potomac River and get out and take over everything? Are they going to invade New York and San Francisco and meet in Kansas City? No, I don't think so. And so I really didn't understand that. But not long after that, I got to thinking about it. And I said, well, Ronald Reagan was raised in a little bit different generation than mine. He was right before me, and he was alive in 1933 when Adolf Hitler was democratically elected Chancellor of Germany. And then through manipulation in the Bundestag, he became Chancellor for life. I mean, they elected Adolf Hitler dictator. Okay. And that was in 1933. And over the next few years, you know what happened. 80% of the people in Europe lost their liberties. 55 million of them not only lost their liberties, they lost their lives. 6 million of them just because they were Jews. 5 million just because they were Christians. And that was only about 9 years after he took over. So that's what Ronald Reagan was talking about when we had the opportunity, when he said that America is only one generation away from losing its liberties. Now you look around today, and we're closer than that, I do believe. 1993, Dr. Jerry Falwell and I were in Dallas, Texas, where he spoke at the First Baptist Church there. After church that night, we went back to the hotel, turned the television on, and there was Ann Richards. She was the governor of the state of Texas. She was the last Democrat governor of the state of Texas. And she was spewing out some vile stuff like you would not believe. And so after it was over with, Jerry was very cool, calm. He reached over, flipped the button, turned the television off, and he said, "Duke, we need to do something that unemploys that lady." And I said, "Okay, let's do it." Now, I'm from Texas. I still wear the boots. Okay. And so I'm from Harris County, Texas. And we started thinking about what we can do. And Jerry said, we need to pull together pastors. And he envisioned what you're doing right here today. We need to pull together pastors in the state of Texas and unemploy that lady. And at that point, we met a pastor in Pearland, Texas, by the name of Rick Scarborough. And Dr. Falwell and Rick Scarborough got to be blood brothers. And for 14 months, we did an event just like this in Texas, in Houston. We ended up with about 3,000 pastors. Now, I won't go into all of the things that happened. I'll let Rick do that. But Dr. Jerry Falwell died 6 years ago. But his vision and his dreams and his spirit still permeate this place. And if Jerry were here today, he would be doing this instead of me. But I'm here to introduce Rick Scarborough, and I want you to welcome him, but first we're going to do a 4-minute video, and then Rick's going to come and speak to you. God bless.
In 1998, Dr. Rick Scarborough founded Vision America to inform and mobilize pastors and their congregations to become salt and light, becoming proactive in restoring Judeo-Christian values in America. The initial advisory board of Vision America included notable Christian leaders Jerry Falwell, Don Wildman, Tim LaHaye, D. James Kennedy, Adrian Rogers, Tim Lee, and Peter Marshall. Spiritual leaders of our time have noted the effective work being done by Vision America. James Dobson says, "Believers in our nation are undertaking many worthy endeavors for the cause of Christ, but nothing I see across the landscape of the local church gives me more hope than the work you are doing through Vision America." Tim LaHaye says, "Vision America is an effective organization of pastors and churches helping Christians. I strongly urge every pastor to become a vital part of Vision America."
If every Christian in America had a passion for Christ like William Carey, this nation would be transformed overnight. Right now, I want you to meet one man who has just such a passion. Dr. Rick Scarborough is mobilizing pastors nationwide to speak out on the pressing moral issues of our day.
Why does a preacher get into politics?
Well, in all honesty, it's the last thing most preachers want to do, but we've finally, many of us, awakened to the fact that if we don't get involved, we're going to lose the country. Wherever I speak, I remind the listeners of the role the preachers played. I am a preacher, by the way, a pastor by calling, and I like to illustrate to them how biblical the form of government we have. There is no question about it. God not only gave us this country, but He led the men who founded it to build a biblically based government that the world has received the blessing from for all of these years until the last generation. You have to ask yourself the question, what next? Are we going to go now and reverse court previous decisions regarding the number of people involved in a marriage? Is polygamy next?
He's also concerned it could directly affect Texas and the state's legalization of same-sex marriage here.
Our God would move mightily. I mean, He would save this country if He found vehicles, hands, feet, mouths in the church that would stand up, speak up, and get the job done. And this is a small but important step toward the beginning of the end of abortion in America.
Human decency for the little child in the womb, who at some point, even those on the Supreme Court who made this horrific decision that Pastor Scarborough talked about, recognized that at some point, this little child in the womb has to be given some rights.
Well, I'd cite the verse when Paul was standing before the Athenians, and he said, God is made out of many nations, one people. But he said it is God who establishes boundaries. He establishes nations. We have boundaries. Our country was established as a nation built upon laws, and we cannot willy-nilly change the laws to accommodate the present condition.
When taking an effective stand on moral issues, the impacts are felt in the local and national media. Vision America's work has been featured in print media including Time Magazine, USA Today, New York Times, Washington Post, Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle, Boston Globe, and the Congressional Quarterly. Dr. Scarborough has also appeared on Larry King Live, Fox News, CBS Evening News, The Blaze with Glenn Beck, C-SPAN, National Public Radio, Focus on the Family, and featured in documentaries such as CNN's award-winning special, God's Warriors, and the HBO documentary, Friends of God. Even though these media appearances impact the culture, Pastor Rick still believes that the pastors in the pulpit are God's greatest agent of change.
Charles Finney said, if there is a decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, the pulpit is responsible for it. If our politics become so corrupt that the very foundations of our government are ready to fall away, say it with me, the pulpit is responsible for it. Can we say amen to that? Let me just say how grateful all of us who played a role in putting this together are for you who are in this room. Let me tell you how special you are. 3,000 pastors received multiple invitations. Our staff at headquarters in Texas, as well as the staff of United in Purpose, Bill Dallas. Bill, just stand up and let everybody see who you are. Bill flew over from California. His staff, scattered across America, ladies and men who work for his organization, personally called 3,000 pastors. We left 95% of them messages. If you're the pastor who has this on your recorder, please change it. My wife made this call. She called a pastor, and he said, my name is so-and-so of the certain Baptist church. It was a Baptist church. He said, no one's in the office today, but if it's an emergency, my number is written in the bulletin. Call me. And we wonder why we're losing? Now think about that. If this is an emergency, my number is written in the bulletin. So my wife drove all the way to Virginia, went to that church, got a bulletin, and we called. No, we didn't go quite that far. Said all that to say, when you registered and when you came today, that puts you in a very elite, small group that we are grateful for. And I hope that when you leave here, our gratitude will have been expressed, not only verbally, but we have a number of gifts for you. All of this is made possible by lay people who just love God and who are willing to underwrite these kinds of efforts. Others have joined along with us, like Patriot Voices. You're going to be hearing from one of God's special anointed servants, in Rick Santorum briefly. Understand, he'll speak, by the way, during our lunch break. I can already hear your stomachs growling, and we're ready for that. If you'll give me 20 minutes, we'll get to that part, and then once you get that underway, we're going to have Rick Santorum walk in dramatically. His plane was delayed 3 hours, so he rented a car, and he's driving cross country to be here. That's not untypical for Rick Santorum, and if you've never met the man in person, I'll promise you, you're going to say this trip was worth it for the opportunity to meet that caliber of a man who loves his country that much. Gentlemen, I was impacted by the likes of Jerry Falwell. You know, a generation ago, you turned on television 24 hours a day, and who could you listen to? Dr. Jerry Falwell, Dr. D. James Kennedy, Adrian Rogers. These men had national platforms and national voices. Now they're no longer with us, and when you flip the channels, if you can find a Christian message, it's a lot harder to find now. My wife and I had to travel Sunday morning, and I'm telling you, we had to hunt to find a preacher on the air, driving through Tennessee, as a matter of fact, where one of our more religious parts of the country. We finally found an outstanding preacher. We were challenged, but we had to travel to make our engagements, so we listened for it. And I said to my wife, how different. It was one generation ago when on Sunday the few who didn't go to church got offended because all they could listen to was the church. And now you have trouble finding them. But likely, if you do find a national ministry, here's what you're going to hear on Sunday morning. I'm okay, you're okay, they're okay, we're okay, and it's okay. I don't need to call any names, do I? What a difference. A generation ago, 10 years ago, you could have a Baptist preacher speaking, flip the channel, and get a Presbyterian preacher, one dressed as we are this morning, the other in a clerical robe, and both with the same message. One high church, one every man's church. Gospel kind of music, high church, totally different in approaches, and yet you never wondered where they stood on any pressing national moral issue. Well, guys, they're gone. And you know what? I think God may have had a better plan. Not 3 or 4 voices, but thousands of voices. Many of them in out-of-the-way places, in places where you may not have a national audience, but you've got an audience. You've got influence. You know how you change America? One heart at a time. You know the only candidate for that kind of change is the pastor. And thank God he has never needed a majority. He does his best work with a minority. The hour is late, but I want to remind all of us today as we think about this, God does his best work just after a crucifixion. And I'm telling you, the country right now is on the brink of national collapse, fiscally, morally, in every dimension. And the only hope is the preacher. You know, in the era before the Civil War, when this country was clearly divided, and when businessmen and preachers found justification for using human beings to line their pocketbooks with wealth, buying and selling our black brothers and sisters, and the preachers justifying it because the givers, the financial stability of the church depended on it. So they jerked a verse here and one there and found a way of even justifying slavery. It was an attorney, oddly enough. It was a Matt Staver. It was a John Graves who got a hold of Blackstone's commentary on the law and had a revelation that Jesus really was, and the essence of truth was Jesus. After all, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And a lawyer turned preacher began traveling this country and and brought us the second great awakening. The first gave us the revolution. We heard Dan so clearly and forthrightly present that visually and otherwise, and is now living that example. But the second great awakening was led by a lawyer turned preacher. He preached against the tide. He called the preachers who were compromising. And you know something, not all of them bought in. Some of them totally rejected him, as they did his predecessors, George Whitefield and others. But his steadfastness in preaching the truth began to unleash that untapped reservoir of other preachers whose names were never put in print. And without researchers like Pastor Dan and others going back and finding who they are, would have never been known. Most of them still aren't known. And yet they began calling their congregations to repentance, even though the wealthy people who profited in slavery might walk out the door. Preachers, you got in the ministry for one reason, because you fell so in love with Jesus you couldn't do anything else. Amen? Amen. I haven't met many preachers who got into it for the money. But you know, after offending 2 or 3 deacon boards because you wouldn't compromise, and after getting fired or pushed out a time or two, it's real easy when the kids are in high school to begin to say, you know, I better go along to get along. And the day you make that decision, your ministry is dead. You're a country club manager. You're no longer useful to the kingdom. We are lucky, fellas, because God has given us a second chance. Many of us who've lost our passion, perhaps. This country's on the brink of disaster, and the only method God has is his men who are in those pulpits. And that's why we're here, trying to find the remnant. Charles Finney was right. If there is a decay of conscience, the pulpit's responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the world loses its interest in Christianity, are we there? Say it with me. The pulpit is responsible for it. If Satan rules our halls of legislation, are we there? The pulpit is responsible for it. Now listen how he finalized this series of statements. If our politics become so corrupt. Let me just stop right there. A lot of preachers want nothing to do with politics because it's so dirty. And it is, gentlemen. It is because 5% choose our leaders, choose those who run for office. Do you realize how much power you possess that you're not using? And I don't mean dynamite power. I mean exousia power, authority. Do you realize how much power you possess? I'm not calling you to be political operations, but I'm asking you to help us find those men who can't be bought, whom Jethro spoke to Moses about, men of integrity, men who can't be bartered or bought. The place to find them is your church. I'm telling you, it is men who have staked their life on the foundation of God's word that make the leaders that can change this nation. And if we're not even registering, if we're not even voting, then you can rest assured we're not going to find those men. I asked them to put up a picture of the church, which likely has been up there, and I didn't refer to it, but I want to refer to that church. That is a famous painting by Vincent van Gogh. Now, I am not a connoisseur of great paintings. Give me Western art. I love it. But, that's impression art especially. It doesn't do a lot for me. It looks like a drunk must have painted it. But I want you to notice this painting because it was painted in the last year of Vincent van Gogh's life, and his life is often overlooked. You see, Vincent van Gogh wasn't always a painter. His father and his grandfather were Dutch Reformed pastors, very well esteemed Dutch Reformed pastors. So it was just natural growing up in that family that he pursued the family calling. Early in life, he felt a call to ministry. He was theologically trained, and once he graduated with distinction, he received his first assignment. He was sent to Belgium to pastor miners, And those European miners were among the poorest people on the planet. Now, this young preacher who grew up in the home of a pastor had never been around such poverty or in such an environment. He saw people on the edge of starvation, dying of all manner of ills connected to working in the mines in those early days. And he loved them with the love of Christ. Rather than move or stay in the parsonage, a beautiful home provided by the denomination, he chose to move into a hovel and live among the people. Took every possession that he owned as a young preacher and sold it and gave it to the poor. Had at best 2 changes of clothes, and that's all he owned. And obviously the church began to explode. They'd never had a preacher like this. But when the superintendents came down to check on the young preacher several months later, they were shocked that he was living like that. They reported back to the officials of the church, and they came and made a visit. And when they saw how he, quote, was demeaning the office of pastor, they fired young Vince Van Gogh. Now feeling the full impact of having failed his father and his grandfather, and especially in his mind his Lord, he turned to his second passion, painting. But he couldn't sell enough paintings to make a living. He moved in with another painter and a good friend. And that friend said of him, till the day he died, he read his Bible virtually every day and never lost his passion for Jesus. But he never went back to the organized church. The last painting that sold of a Vince Van Gogh was in the 90s. It sold for $91 million. 2 previous to that, both in the 50 millions. Nobody knows what this painting is worth because the owner won't put it up for sale. But the paintings in his last year of life are the most valuable. And this was painted when he was 37 years old, when he took a gun and put it to his own head and blew his brains out. Now, there's no proof of that. He was despondent. He was full of despair, had seasons of great, great depression. And since a gun was never found, that can't be proven. But most people think somebody walked along, got the gun, and just kept moving. But he died in total heartache. Look at the church now, if you will. What do you notice about it? You'll notice there's no cross anywhere on that church. What else do you notice? There are no doors, just windows. And you see the pathway leading toward the church? It winds and goes around the church. And the pilgrim who appears to be troubled chooses the path to the left looking for an answer. Nobody knows what was in the mind of Vince Van Gogh when he left that painting behind. But perhaps he was saying the church has become irrelevant. Those who are inside don't care about those on the outside, don't care so much as we even build a door, and those on the outside couldn't get in if they wanted to. So they go somewhere else for their answers. And gentlemen, the church in the West, and especially in America, is becoming that church. The only hope for this country is for you and I, the remnant, to stand up and say, enough is enough. When Matt Staver was speaking a while ago, gentlemen, you need to know the implications of that. He's not a hidden figure. He's not unknown to those who are spying now on Americans. The president of one of the largest schools of training of young lawyers in America and head of one of the more effective legal organizations fighting cases before the Supreme Court, his name is known. It's one thing for you and I to stand up and say, I won't bow. Men like this put their lives on the line. Gentlemen, it's time for all of us to be reminded of what it was that we committed our hearts and lives to. Jesus said, come after me. And what did he say? He said, take up your cross. Well, gentlemen, the cross is not an ornament to hang around your neck or put on the top of your steeple. It's an instrument of death. And make no mind, Jesus, who could see beyond that present moment, looking toward his own ignominious death, fully understood what he was saying when he said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and come after me. Gentlemen, we've got to get back to that kind of living. And, you know, I've discovered this in my life. I used to say all the time from the pulpit, if a man won't tithe, he certainly won't die for Jesus. Well, gentlemen, if you won't risk somebody in your church criticizing you for taking a stand on a clear moral issue that has political overtones, then neither will you. When I started getting involved in calling my people to political action, I didn't have a clue the chairman of the Democratic Party was in my church. I just knew her as a member. And boy, I'll never forget the day she took my head off at the back of the church in front of a handful of people. And the incredible deliverance I found when I smiled at her and said, sorry you feel that way, but I'm not changing my mind. Now, folks, listen carefully. We've gone from My Little Marjorie to Lady Gaga and Miley Cyrus. We've gone from Leave It to Beaver to Beavis and Behindhead. I cleaned that up for church. We've gone from schools that honored God and taught the Bible in my lifetime to schools that have totally shut God out and teach homosexuality as a preferred lifestyle. Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. In the absence of truth, we are seeing increasing tyranny in this country. And the only ones that can unlock America and set her free again is you and me. When are you going to finally say enough is enough? I did in 1992. And by the way, when you leave today, those sacks back there, they're loaded with books and writings of other men that I think that we hope will help you in your preaching ministry. Every one of you in your packets have a 25 individualized items. They're a half page or a page apiece that should stimulate your preaching theologically on the great issues of our day. And that's our gift to you, as well as a plethora of information on our website, visionamerica.org, where there's more than 100 sermons that I've preached across the country and during a 2-year interim period with the local church to that church. Some of them very politically driven, most of them just teaching. But you know, in the course of every week, there's something happening on the front page of the paper that you ought to be able to apply your sermon to. Make it relevant, guys. And those books and booklets, 2 of the little booklets are simply sermons I preached to the congregation of First Baptist Pearland on the southeast side of Houston, where I was pastor. One on the day that John L. Ashcroft was our special guest, who said, preacher, you got to put that in print. And when the senator tells you to do that, later the attorney general, you do it. So I did. But it illustrates how easy it is to apply the gospel. And gentlemen, if they'll help you Sunday morning, preach them. One of them, by the way, is a picture of Bill Clinton on TV. The very minute he said, it all depends on what is. I figured if the president didn't know what is, I'd preach on it. And the following Sunday, that sermon was preached. And when you read that sermon, thank you. When you read that sermon, by the way, it reads just like a secretary typed it right off the tape. It's not the most, I'm not real proud of it in the condition it's in, but I left it that way so you'd know it was right off the tape. And I don't preach as well as I write when I have time to go back and spell check. By the way, wasn't it curious? It struck me as curious. It all depends on what is. Well, is the verb from the verb to be, which gives us the verb, or see, I told you my English wasn't all that good, but I am. Well, what did God say when he revealed himself to man? I am that I am, the ultimate absolute. Was taken by the president, the same verb in its root form, to justify his own immorality and say, well, at the very moment that they asked me that question. I wasn't having sex with Monica Lewinsky, so it all depends on what is. So I didn't technically lie under oath, because when they asked me if I was doing that, I wasn't at that moment. That was his argument. Why didn't every pulpit in America cry out for justice at that point? He's now the most heralded man in the world. And the young lady who is a daughter of some father's life has been forever destroyed. Gentlemen, when are we going to say enough is enough? In 1992, in my 18th month as pastor of First Baptist Pearland, where I intended to spend the rest of my life, southeast suburb of Houston, in an exploding part of Houston, it's still exploding. God had put us, my wife and I, with our 3 young children there, and we intended to invest our life in that church. First 18 months, we baptized over 500 people into the church. It was exploding. God was blessing. We were looking for land so we could relocate the congregation, because we had a building that would only seat 1,100 people. We were maxing out. We were bordered against a railroad track, a 4-lane highway, and nestled into a subdivision on 3.5 acres of land. Even those old crusty Baptists thought we ought to relocate. And so we were looking for land. Now, gentlemen, that's not when you want to get involved in politics. Amen? Well, on a Sunday morning, a lady asked me, "Are you going to the high school assembly tomorrow?" I didn't even know there was one. But when I investigated, I thought, I ought to be there, but I've got a prospective staff member come in. Church was growing. And I've devoted the day to him. So I sent Rod Compton to take my place. Rod was with me for 13 years in 2 different churches. I used to brag to my pastor friends I was just like Moses. I leaned on my rod and my staff, because Rod was a staff. So anyway, Rod went to that high school assembly. Come back at 11 o'clock, he was ashen-faced. He said, "Preacher, you won't believe it." Said, "Well, tell me what you heard." He would not repeat to me and our guest what he'd heard. So I handed the guest preacher off that was there to look at the facilities over and talk about joining our staff to Rod for lunch, and I went to the 5th of the 5 assemblies. Now, gentlemen, as God would have it, my daughter was in that assembly, halfway between me and the speaker, about 500 students in all. So I sat there and I said, "Scarborough, no matter how bad this is, don't make a scene." Misty's in the 18th month of transitioning from another high school. She's a senior. You don't embarrass her. She's fragile. For all the reasons of any daddy, I said, "Don't make a scene." And I did so good the first 15 minutes. The young lady was there to talk about AIDS. It was still being called GRIDS at that point, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency Syndrome. But that wasn't politically correct, so we changed it to AIDS. She was there to tell the kids that, sure, you're going to have sex, but if you have safe sex, it's okay. And so she talked about every sex act that you can imagine, and some that you should not imagine. She talked about anal sex, oral sex, you name it. The only rule was, don't you judge someone else. That was a rule. The longer I sat there, the angrier I got as a pastor and as a father. When she pulled out a condom and stretched it and made a lewd remark and a couple of jokes about the size of the male organ, and then blew it up like a balloon and wrote 94%, put it on a whiteboard behind her, and then told those students that if they used one of those, they could have all the sex they wanted and be effectively protected against the dread disease of AIDS. Well, that's when I had enough. And so I raised my hand. I was in a suit comparable to this morning. She probably thought I was a principal. She was very courteous. She said, "Yes, sir." Misty, my daughter, almost passed out. I'm telling you, I could see her. She didn't know I was present, and she's now a part of our staff, but I'm telling you, if she were here, she'd tell you, she just didn't know it. I said, "Ma'am, where did you get that statistic?" You know, gentlemen, in God's sovereignty, I'd been reading everything I could get my hands on the subject of AIDS. It was brand new. People were dying. I believed, still do, it was a judgment upon a lifestyle God forbid. And so I was reading all I could find to educate our people about this new disease. I knew for a fact that no one purported condoms to be that effective, especially the kind you buy at a truck stop. So when she said that, I raised my hand. I said, "Where did you get that statistic?" She said, "The CDC," went right back into her planned remarks. Well, I would be willing to wager, if I were a betting man, nobody there knew who the CDC was, but I did because I'd been reading their materials. Center for Disease Control, Atlanta, Georgia. And I knew they said that condoms weren't that effective in preventing pregnancy. And the male sperm is 100 times larger than the AIDS virus. So I raised my hand again. You know what? She ignored me. You know it's hard to ignore? A Baptist preacher in a suit in a high school auditorium where they're talking about anal and oral sex. Kids were all saying, "Who is that guy?" It's Misty's dad. That's the Baptist preacher. You could hear it rifling through the crowd. I'm persistent if I'm nothing else. I just kept my hand up. She finally, exasperation, said, "Yes, sir," the second time. I said, "Ma'am, I've read everything the Center for Disease Control, Atlanta, Georgia says on that subject. Nowhere do they say that condoms are that effective. In fact," and I repeated the same thing I said to you about the size of the male sperm. Well, she now breaks out in red splotches. Man, I wanted to go up there and hug her. I felt sorry for her. A lady stands up across the room, whom I later found out was the head of the home economics department who had sponsored this assembly. She shouted at me, "I've read the same statistic in a teen magazine, and it's true." I wanted to say, "Are you kidding me?" But I understood there's a time for everything, and this wasn't the time for a shouting match. So I said, "Thank you," and I sat down. But you know, I'd had sense enough to take my pocket recorder with me, and I got this all on tape. When the assembly was over, and by the way, she went in at that point an emotional diatribe about her own sex life, told how she was AIDS infected, her boyfriend wasn't, they slept together, and he was safe because they used condoms. That was her testimony. I put my head in my hands, gentlemen, and I'm not exaggerating at all here. I had to fight off crying when I considered how many people would die because of that assembly. When the assembly was over, everybody had to pass by the stationary desk where I was seated, the only exit. And I'm telling you, I got cold stares, I got a few thank yous, and a whole lot of people who just wanted to tell the preacher off. But there was only one person in that crowd that mattered to me. You know what her name was? Misty. I'll never forget how Misty worked her way through the stationary desk, not down the aisle, got to me as quick as she could, threw her arms around my neck, kissed me on this cheek, and whispered in this ear, "Daddy, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you." And that was like saying "sick it" to a cur dog, I don't mind telling you. I'll be quick now. Let me tell you what came out of that. I spoke to Amy briefly. I spoke to a school board meeting 10 days later that had to be moved 4 times because of the crowd. I took the recorded remarks and made a transcript, read them word for word to our congregation after I gave them a chance to get the children out. 4-letter words and all. I'm not bragging about that. But sometimes our people they despair for their lack of knowledge. They're so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good. And I felt like if it was good enough for the students at the high school, their parents ought to know. Boy, when I finished reading those remarks, 12 pages in all, I had a couple of men ready to go down and burn the high school down. I had to calm them down. When I spoke to the school board, they sat on an elevated platform with 7 people that lined up to speak. I was first, and they had 6 that they lined up to counteract this radical Baptist preacher. But you know, folks, I spent a week praying and preparing and fasting before I spoke. The only word God clearly gave me was, "A soft word turns away wrath." So I made it clear I wasn't there to assault anyone. I knew that they had done what they thought was the best for our kids, but then I simply enumerated what was wrong with that assembly. And you know what? Those school board members were all parents. And after they heard what I had to say, they started shifting their opinion to my side. I learned something that day I never forgot. The more I talked, the more people stood up and applauded. 10 or 12 standing ovations, 600 people present. I learned that day that politicians can count. And they could tell where the tide of public opinion on this subject was. Out of that, I got to name 3 members to a committee to rewrite the sex education curriculum out of our church. Our church donated $4,000 in books and materials to the library on abstinence-based education. But more importantly, I went into our pulpit and I repented, because that was the first school board meeting I ever attended. I went because I was angry. I began preaching on the need for the church to be the church in everything. That some are called to public service. That when I couldn't go to every school board meeting, certainly somebody could. In 2 election cycles, 4 of our people were elected out of 7, changed the direction of that high school. We started running our people, or asking our people to run for public office. 3 of them ran for the city council. Guess what? We found out the good old boys controlled our city council. And once order was brought, Christian integrity was brought, that little sleepy country town on the edge of Houston exploded in organized growth. People wanted to live there. It went from 19,000 to 90,000 in one 10-year census span. The following May, the president said, called the nation to prayer. Well, I found out we didn't have any National Day of Prayer in Pearland, so I went to the Ministerial Alliance. I'd never been to one of them. And I said, can we on Thursday, first Thursday in May, organize a prayer meeting at City Hall? You know what the president of the Ministerial Alliance said to me? We can't do that. That's the day the bank buys our lunch at the country club. That was what he said. So I organized a prayer meeting. They got so shamed they all came, but they came mad. They didn't know much about me, so I went on to lunch that day with them, and boy, they got after me hard. Folks, listen, there's right and there's wrong. But I want to give you the good news. I wish I could tell you the whole story. It's in the book you're going to get. Enough is enough. Well, those preachers came around with leadership, and we soon had the most effective organization in that city. A few years later, when they had the centennial for the city, they came and asked the Ministerial Alliance, what would y'all like to do to be a part of our centennial celebration? So we officially had an area-wide crusade in which 300 people gave their heart to Jesus. I remember walking around the football field all night with the one pastor that opposed me the greatest, Casey Jones, Presbyterian pastor. He and I became close friends, and we prayed one night all night for that upcoming crusade, walking to stay awake. And I saw God move. We soon, people began finding out what we were doing in Pearland. And so Jerry Falwell and others said, man, we need to take this guy around and let him give testimony. I got the privilege of traveling all over the country with Jerry Falwell with my 3-minute testimony. And I can do this in 3 minutes, but now I pay for these things so I can take more time. But in 1994, Dr. Falwell and others advising a bunch of us neophytes, we organized pastors all over the city of Houston, businessmen, put up the money. We had luncheons, dinners, breakfast. We soon had hundreds of pastors registering their people to vote. And in one election cycle, we turned out 51 liberal county and city court justices and replaced them with 51 God-fearing, God-seeking officials at the county and city levels of government. That got the attention of a wealthy man in another city who said, could you do this in Texas? And in 2002, that man gave us $800,000. Another man gave us $400,000. We organized pastors around Texas, 2,500, and all got involved. And for the first time since Reconstruction, every statewide office holder that was elected was pro-life, pro-family, and approved by the pastors. Both houses of our state government flipped from pro-choice to pro-life. And now, 10 years later, or 12 years later, Texas is known as the most prosperous state in America in every dimension. And it all began when preachers quietly, without endorsing candidates, just did what is right. You have no idea how much power, exousia, you possess in the name of Jesus. And if you'll work with us, we'll see this state begin the process of change. Now, we may not make a big impact this time, we might. But you got a Senate race coming up next year. So help us prove preachers care. I want to say that we've had a lot of outstanding speakers at these events. We've held them for 15 years. But I've never gotten the kind of feedback I got from the folks who heard Rick Santorum. I alluded to, I didn't actually mention him in this crowd or this group this morning, but one of the businessmen who put up a lot of money and helped me when we were mobilizing all those pastors in Harris County and the county surrounding Houston in 1994 was a businessman by the name of Steve Holtze. Steve is a guy very involved in politics. We've often tried to get him to run for state office himself, but he's a well-respected medical doctor, has a very established practice, and he is also a committed Christian. He ran over to me after Rick Santorum spoke, threw his arms around me, and he said, "Rick, I had no idea this guy was like this. Why didn't you tell me? I supported the wrong person." And I wanted to say, "Well, Steve, it's because nobody can tell you anything," but I didn't say that. He's a guy that he thinks for himself. Let's just put it that way. But it illustrated what I think you'll experience if you've never heard Rick Santorum speak. He's a man of principle. I've been in rooms of small gatherings where a different answer would have appeased a lot of money people, and what you get is what he believes, not what he thinks you want him to say. He's a principled man. All of us know him for his pro-life career in the Senate and the stands that he took, the bills that he passed. I like to say Rick Santorum is not only pro-life, he's prolific. He has 7 children. So he is a pro-life and prolific father. All of us grew to love Bella in the course of the campaign, the child that everybody else said, "Well, that child is just too needy. You'd be better off before she's born to abort her." Instead, the parents gave birth to that child, and the whole family, I think you'll hear some remarks about this, have benefited. But now the country has benefited by seeing the love of a family around a child that's quite special. I want you to join with me in giving a warm welcome to Rick Santorum.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rick. It's an honor to be here with you, and I'm excited that you continue to do the great work that Vision America is doing, and trying to rally the troops and the leaders of our country to take their rightful role in our country. And so I was honored to be honored by you and your organization down in Houston, and jumped at the opportunity to be with you here today to talk to all of you. And just first and foremost, I want to say thank you. We ran for president in 2012. Some of you may not know this, but the last time I ran for office, I was elected twice to the House, twice to the Senate. But I ran for re-election in 2006. And lost by the largest margin of any incumbent United States senator in 30 years. Now 40 years. No one has matched my accomplishment. And 4 years after having lost, some would say, a disgraceful race, I did the next logical thing. I announced that I was running for president of the United States. Now, most people would find that to be absolute insanity. Yet, we ended up winning 11 states, more states than any challenger to the establishment candidate since Ronald Reagan in 1976. And I know how we did that. First and foremost, we did it because of the enormous amount of people across this country lifting me and my family and those in our campaign up in prayer. And so I know a lot of you, because many of you have already come back and we've chatted a little bit. I know a lot of you have said that you prayed for me, and many of you said that you were disappointed, not as disappointed as I was, that I wasn't on the ballot in Virginia, but you prayed for me anyway. And so I just want to say, for the first thing, and you all know this, you're pastors, but the first thing that you have to remember is the power of your prayer for this country. And I know we have an obligation, the Bible says we have an obligation to pray for our leaders and to pray for our country. I'm just telling you, as one leader who was summarily ignored by the national press, wasn't invited to several of the debates, wasn't even listed on polls for up until shortly before the Iowa caucuses. The national media didn't even bother, even though I was in the race, they didn't even bother to put me on there because I was a blip. I was put at the end of every debate. You know how they line up and they put the important folks in the center and the folks in the end they don't pay much attention to? I was that guy at the end for almost every single debate. After there were 22 debates, I think after 16 or 17 debates, University of Minnesota published a report as to the amount of time each candidate got during the debates to answer questions. Now, I was, of course, dead last, substantially below the next highest person, I think 4 or 5 minutes below the next highest person, which was Herman Cain. And Herman Cain had dropped out of the race 4 debates ago. And he still had, on average, more time than I did. So just to give you an idea how much I was ignored, yet we were able to do a miraculous thing. We were able to win into Iowa and won a race that, well, I spent $30,000 on television. Now, just to get an understanding, I mean, my opponent spent millions, and yet we were able to come out victorious. So whether, obviously there are lots of examples from the Bible about not having to have a whole lot of money and a whole lot of soldiers in order to win. But the soldier that matters is the soldiers that are out there praying, because he can do a lot more than any of my volunteers or I can do. And so I just want to affirm to you that as someone who's been out there at the top level, running for President of the United States, your prayers mattered. Your prayers mattered. There's no other explanation. None of the pundits have been able to decipher how did we do it. They still dismiss me now. Oh, it was a fluke. I'm never even talked about in the 2016. Nobody ever mentioned. Why? Because it was just a fluke. There was no reason for him to do this. It was just an opposition vote. But we know better. They don't understand it because it doesn't make sense in their world where God is not a factor. And so again, one of the things I wanted to do when I came here today was to reemphasize what Rick and all the speakers have said about the importance of you in this process and what you can do with your churches and what we are called to do to be leaders here. But I also want you to remember you're also called to be prayer warriors and the important role that that plays also in this process. Let me just tell you a little bit about what I think is going on in the country today and how you fit in. I think we are at a transformational moment in American history, arguably world history, since we are such an important, well, up until a few weeks ago, a very important part of the world. We are at a point right now, we're at a tipping point, and arguably we may have crossed it, and we have to sort of push it back the other way, about what kind of country we are and what kind of future we are going to leave to the next generation. You know, I believe that America is an exceptional country. It's not an exceptional country because we have the strongest military. It's not an exceptional country because we have the greatest economy and we have the most wealth of anybody. It's an exceptional country because America is different than every other country, therefore unique, but exceptional in this way. There is no other country, if you think about it, there's no other country in which the people in that country are not identified by either a race or an ethnicity as to what makes them a member of that country. We're all hyphenated Americans, right? African Americans, Italian Americans, Hispanic Americans, whatever. Well, what's the American part mean? We all know what the race or ethnicity part means, but what does the American part mean? Well, I'm a first-generation American. My dad came over to this country from Italy. He was brought over by my grandfather when he was a boy. My grandfather fought in World War I, survived barely. and could have gone to any country. He wanted to move because Mussolini had taken power in Italy and he wanted nothing to do with him. He could have gone anywhere. He spoke 7 languages. That's because he worked on a mail train throughout Europe and he got to learn all those languages. And he decided to come to America. Now, I was told he actually seriously considered going to either Switzerland or France. If he'd have gone to France, he could have lived in France as he did in America for 50 years. And after those 50 years, he would never have been a Frenchman. But when he came to America and embraced what America was about, he became an American. America and American, being an American, is not about an ethnicity or race. It's about a set of values and principles. And so when America changes, and it is changing, then the whole fundamental principles about which we believe in, about what makes America unique, exceptional, and special, are going away. And what is that? You'll hear lots of people say lots of things about economics and our economic policy and foreign policy. You hear, there's one thing that makes us different than every other country in the world. If you go back to the Founding Fathers and you ask somebody in June of 1776 from Georgia what they were fighting for, or from Pennsylvania or from Massachusetts, they'd have told you very different things, maybe more than one thing. But after July 2nd, published July 4th, 1776, then Americans knew what they were fighting for. We had a purpose, and it was laid out in the Declaration of Independence. And it's these words that we all know. Our school children used to be taught these things. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The Marquis de Lafayette, who came from France to help us win our freedom from Britain, was called back to France after the Revolution to help fight the French Revolution. When he left America, he brought with him a picture frame. On one side of the picture frame was his copy of the Declaration of Independence. On the other side, it was left blank. He went to France in hopes of placing in that frame a similar declaration from the people of France. He died with that picture frame empty. The French Revolution was a very different revolution than the American Revolution. The American Revolution was about God-given rights, and that the government's role was to protect those rights. That rights did not come from the government, they came from God, because you are a creation of His and you have dignity because you're His. That's the foundational principle of our country. No other country in the history of the world, before or since, has ever established a government on that principle. We are it. We are unique and we are exceptional. So when Vladimir Putin says, "What right do you have to call yourself exceptional?" we should have fired back immediately and told him why. But politicians don't talk that way anymore. They don't say the G word anymore, except at the end when they say, "God bless America," like you say, "Hey, nice to meet you." It doesn't mean anything. If God's just at the end of the speech and He's not woven through the speech, then that's a token. I encourage you to read speeches from not our founders. Don't go back 200 years, go back 50 years and read presidents and other leaders of our country and how openly we were reliant upon God. We were not afraid to say those words. But now we are.
And what's happened? We are slowly losing our inheritance. We are slowly losing the inheritance of being a descendant of the American Revolution. And we're quickly becoming a descendant of a different revolution, the French Revolution. Let's look at what happened in France. What were the watchwords? There were 3 words that were spread everywhere as the reason and the energy behind the French Revolution. 3 words: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Not paternity. Fraternity means brotherhood. That's where we get our rights from each other, from the government, whoever is controlling. And what happened? The reign of terror, mob rule, Bonaparte, an emperor, ruling the people, creating rights. Was it like that before? Sure, you had kings who did the same thing. We were governed by a sovereign who allocated rights. And we replaced a sovereign king with mob rule, with dictatorship. But the interesting part of the French Revolution, it was specifically anti-God, anti-clerical. They killed religious, they burned churches. Go to Europe today. All of Europe is a descendant of the French Revolution. Churches are empty. They're museums run by the state. Church attendance is in single digits, and the countries are dying. Look at the European Union. The word God appears nowhere in any of their documents. Specifically secular. And the country is dying. In most Western European countries, only 1 in 4 women have children. What does that mean? That means their civilization is dying. The population of Spain and France, Italy, it's being cut in half in every generation because they're having less. They're having only 1 child for every 2 people. Why? Because without faith, without God, there is no hope. There's no vision. It's just about me. It's just about, well, I always say the root of all sin is a violation of the first commandment. It's about putting that false God and me before the real God. Ladies and gentlemen, that's where we're headed. And we're headed fast. So what do we do about it? Well, I can tell you, when I came into the Congress, I had no intention of doing a darn thing about it. I got elected. Frankly, I ran for office because I thought the guy who was in office, who was a Democrat, I was a Republican. It was a heavily Democratic seat. It was a bad year for a Republican to run. No one else wanted to run. I was unopposed in the primary. It was in Pittsburgh, which at that time was certainly not a very Republican area. And I decided to run only because the guy really made me mad. Because I would go to his town meetings, I was active in the community, and he lied to me. He'd say one thing at home and then go vote the other way and expect us idiots not to know any better. And so I just said, well, someone's got to run against this guy just to prove a point. And I end up winning. And then I got redistricted into a 70% Democratic district, even worse, and I won again. So I decided to run for the United States Senate against another incumbent. I won again. I was 32 years old when I was elected to Congress. I'd never run for office before in my life. I mean, it's 1 in a million. You win those kind of races. And so here I am, starting a family at the time, busy running against, the incredible odds, having no chance, just working hard. And I got to the United States Senate, and I had a 6-year term. It finally dawned on me that I was here at age 36 for some reason, but I didn't know why. And And then something happened that changed my life. Well, two things happened. Number one, because of the Senate schedule and my wife, and I've heard a lot of stories about not having your family with you in Washington and what can happen when that happens. And I said, I'm not going to let that happen to me. And so we moved our family down, and I went to a new church. I happened to be walking in the halls of the Capitol one day, and a fellow senator from Oklahoma came up to me and said, Rick, you ever thought about going to the Bible study held here in the Senate by the chaplain? And two people, my pastor and the Senate chaplain, those two men changed my life. I had never said the word abortion on the floor of the House or Senate, ever. Was never planning to do so. Because when you do that, you pay a price. Your state representative is here, your delegate, sorry. I forgot, you guys are a little different here. She's paying a price because she said those words and fought those battles. But for 5 years, I never said anything about it because I was told, you know, it's one thing to be a conservative and to vote that way. It's another thing to speak out on these moral issues. You will be ostracized and marginalized within your own party. I always say after I started to do that, my children would pick up the paper, and after a while they thought my first name was Ultra. Because I went from the conservative senator from Pennsylvania. You know, if you're a liberal, they never say the liberal senator from Massachusetts, they say the senator from Massachusetts. But if you're a conservative, they always say conservative senator, right? Well, now it's ultra-conservative senator. I didn't change my vote. I just had the audacity to talk about issues that, well, we're not supposed to talk about and fight over. We're just supposed to accept the inevitability of the cultural change that's going on in America. Well, those two pastors changed my life because for the first time they spoke the gospel to me. I'd grown up in a church, but I'd never been touched. Never had my eyes opened, like scales falling off your eyes. It became so clear to me, oh, that's why I'm here. So when you think and you stand up at the pulpit and you think, well, another Sunday, looking over my notes, and you think, well, you know, you look out there and they're just, don't pass up the opportunity. God put you here for a reason. To be a shepherd. To go after that sheep that wandered away. Don't be afraid. If there's any message I have for you today. I went out and I did things that they told me as a senator from Pennsylvania I was crazy to do. They said I'd never win another election. Well, they were wrong. I won one more. But I paid a price for what I did. But I have been so blessed because of it. God has opened so many doors, windows, everything you can possibly imagine. Because I simply wasn't afraid to speak His truth. And that's my challenge to you today. Be not afraid. Be not afraid. I know the popular culture says what you believe in is wrong. I know that there are people out in your congregation who may not give you some money because you talk about issues that make them uncomfortable. You know, one of the things I found is, well, put it succinctly, Jesus had it right. It really is hard for those rich people to get into heaven. Because they start to worship idols. And they start to believe that they actually got that money on their own. And then they want to make everybody around who points out the error of their way be quiet, and they have the money to silence you. They silence you by giving it to you and saying things like, now, here's what I'd like you to preach about, or don't talk about these things because, you know, that's just too controversial. I'll tell you a little story. I was running for president, decided, well, I was at the time, I wasn't running. I hadn't announced yet, but I was thinking about it. And I got asked by a group of folks in New York, billionaires, who were screening the Republican field. I was one of the last screened. But I went there and met with them and spent it was an hour-long breakfast. And the first 20 minutes to half hour, all they did was hammer me on abortion and gay rights and religious liberty, all these issues, all these hot-button issues. And finally, after a while, after answering all their questions, I finally stopped and I said, I just have a question. Did you ask Mitt Romney all these questions? Did you ask Tim Pawlenty all these questions? Did you ask Newt Gingrich all these questions? Did you ask anybody else all these questions? And one person said no. I said, well, why are you asking me these questions? I have the same positions as each and every one of them. We have the exact same position on all these issues. Yet you didn't ask them these questions, you're asking me. Why? The guy leaned forward and said, because you mean it. Do you mean it? Now, you can say you're against, you can lay the sins out, you can lay the obligations you have as a Christian out, but do you mean it? If you don't talk about it, you don't mean it. If you don't set it as a priority, you don't mean it. I know, I have 7 kids. My kids know when I mean it and when I don't. If I let him get away with things, they know, well, he doesn't mean it. If I don't talk about it, well, he must not mean it. And they learn. Your sheep learn. Politics important? Yes. But you don't talk about it. You must not mean it. Is faith important in our lives? Yes, it is. But the schools don't talk about it. We must not mean it. Look at all the things that we must not mean by what we in our churches do and we in society do. So I just say to the folks in New York, and I say to you, I do mean it. And that's the reason I know. Look, I know that's the reason I'm not on anybody's list of potential 2016 candidates out of the establishment in the party. I understand that. And I'm okay with that. Because that's not who I answer to. And by the way, I did perfectly fine without them last time. Okay? So I just want to share with you. What's at stake in America is who we are. Whether we are going to be the Americans that are descendants of the American Revolution, or we are going to be like the folks across the pond. And we know where we're headed. We know where we're headed. I wrote a book in 2005 called It Takes a Family. Big old thick book, 429 pages. If you ever have trouble sleeping at night, pick up a copy. Surefire. But I talked about this problem, not in those words, in the words I've described to you as the French and American Revolution, but about the forces that are affecting this country. I call it the bigs versus the littles. I said this as a Republican. Big business, big labor, big education, big government, the bigs. Look at our colleges and universities, with some notable exceptions. With the exceptions of, okay, more than a few handfuls, but relatively, probably single-digit percentages of colleges in this country. They are out there brainwashing the next generation of leaders in our country. The numbers are overwhelming. 62% of children who go into colleges and universities with a faith commitment leave without it. And what do? We just funnel more money to them. We get government money to them. And we say somehow or another we're doing this for the children. Giving them tens of thousands of dollars of loans so we can pay professors to work 3 hours a week and then indoctrinate our children the rest of that time is not helping the country. We lost education first, higher education. Over time, we've lost primary and secondary education in the public schools. God is no longer allowed. And if you look at the textbooks that are in public schools in America, you'd be stunned. I was stunned. I didn't realize how bad it was. But one of the most dominant history textbooks in American public schools today was written by a Marxist. Howard Zinn. Look it up. We've lost primary and secondary education. They now don't teach the truth. They don't teach anything about faith or God. And they teach about the state. Look at big businesses. Every big business in America, with a few exceptions, and you probably know them because they are such an exception, bow to the left in all of their social policy agenda. In fact, the leaders of the big corporations now are trying to pollute organizations like the Boy Scouts. Where did the change in the Boy Scouts come? It came from the big funders, the head of AT&T, on the board, forcing it from the top down. Big labor, same thing. The bigs. If you look at it, big Hollywood, big media, we've lost them all. Aristotle said, give me the storytellers and I'll control the country in a generation. Who's telling your children the stories today? 100 years ago, you passed on stories on the front stoop by reading a book to your kids. This is the book your kid reads. Generations ago, a statue was made to symbolize the age. There's a man like this. It's called the Thinker. This will be the statue for this generation. Or this, the mini version. I'm looking, just checking to see if anybody's doing that to me right now. Just, I'm constantly looking for that. But that's what it is. It's a drug. Literally, it's a drug. You look at all the psychological analysis, it's a drug. What it does to your brain. They've hooked them. And what messages are they sending? Oh, you can put up walls, you can put up gates, you can put up net nannies and all those things. But is that what our job is? Is that what our job as Christians is? Keep out the bad? Put up the walls? Get in the crouch? Is that our job? I don't know about you, but the Bible I read says the gates of hell will not prevail against us. We are to be on the offensive. We are to be sharing the truth. But we don't. We don't do it in politics because we're afraid of the IRS. Now, there's a legitimate reason to be afraid of the IRS. But you know what? Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's caring enough about what the matter is to overcome that fear. We need courage. courage in the pulpit. We need courage in politics. We need courage in the popular culture and in education. There is no end of places where we need courage. So what fights the bigs? In my book, I called them the littles. Who are the two littles? There's two left. Just two. The family and the church. And guess what they're after right now? One thing I learned about the opposition, they do not like competition. They are after the family, and they are after you, the church. They are going to bully you and intimidate you and tell you what to think. Even now, you hear the administration, instead of using the words freedom of religion, freedom of worship. Now, to the untrained ear, that sounds the same. Freedom of worship means Thomas Road Baptist Church. Do whatever you want to do in the church. Preach whatever you want to preach for now. Sing whatever song you want to sing. But when you walk out that door, you're mine. You will do what I tell you to do, not what your faith tells you to do. That's illegitimate. That's just worship. It's happening now. To your Catholic brothers and sisters in the Obama regulations. It will happen. It is happening. On the issue of marriage and what you can do outside. Look at all these businesses that you see in court right now. There is no freedom of religion to participate in the economy as you want. None. If the Obama administration really did want to give contraceptives to everybody for free, they could have done that easily. Distribute them for free at any place where people, at the gas store, at a gas station, at the convenience store, just give them out. Not good enough. They had to make you do what they tell you to do. And what do? Nothing. We have a few brave people willing to sue. But what do we do collectively as the body of Christ? Nothing. We go and vote for it. This is our moment.
Amen. Amen.
This is our moment. I have 7 kids at home. I have 3 in college, 3 in Christian schools, and I have a little girl who's disabled who requires 24-hour care. Now, I'll be very honest with you. My bills are enormous. And when I ran for president, I spent 1.5 years without a penny of income. When I got off that trail, one of the reasons I got off that trail, because I was running out of money at home. And my wife questions me, as a good wife would, how are you going to provide for your family? Running around giving speeches, getting involved in politics, is not paying the bills. But she knows as well as I do, there are bigger things afoot than the bills that we have to pay. Let me just say, from one person who a pastor, 2 pastors made all the difference. I'm here because of them. How many of your congregants are out there because of you? And what are you going to do to change that? You have an opportunity here to make a difference. The reason we're losing this battle is one reason and one reason only. The other side wants it more than we do. Why do you think all those textbooks have Marxist history? Because the parents complain about it, do something about it in their schools. Why do the businesses act the way they do? Because the employees scream and holler about it. The shareholders complain about it. Why do the churches not preach the gospel? Because people in the pew complain about it. In every aspect of their life, they live it. Because they want to change. They don't like what we have, and they want to change it. We become really comfortable with what we have and think it's never going to change. We're going to wake up someday, and they're going to tell you, well, you can't say that anymore. Or you can't do that anymore. The truth is a lie. And a lie is the truth. And you will obey. This is our moment. And let me assure you, you can make a difference. Thank you and God bless.